We'll need to, we'll need to.
First, make sure it takes. Us too.
I don't know.
You got his thumb drive. I'm good with it. Yes, good with it.
I will forget this. This way.
I'm good with them. You drive and all that. That's the work.
Move and let you move forward.
Yeah. Turn up both. Okay. All right. Good deal. I don't mind.
Now, we have a clip
And
there.
we do that. Okay, we can see that. Thank you. Yeah, no problem. Everything. Great to have you all with us today. Appreciate so much of you being there last week for the United Way. Great event. It's good to see you. Walking and running and eating and drinking and all kinds of stuff. Looking forward to celebrating you all in the week ahead. I'm excited about the speaker. I've heard Danny speaking excited. Always education and holding just looking forward to that. But I'm to get started, I like to have a conversation with the public communications.
called Remain Standing until all meetings have been adjourned. Our first guest is Rob Gibbs, guest of Penn Gordon. Next, we have Darren and Lisa, guest of one of the members of the Pink Foundation. Next, we have Eric Moss, guest of Mr. Pitt. Then we have Rex Campbell, guest of Kerry Rice. Then we have Liz Simpson with Sueland, guest of Brent Gibbs. And lastly, we have the Grand City Councilman Mark Rich, guest of Mayor Earl. Well,
So glad to have you all with us. Hope you'll plan to come back. Have some good things in store for you in the months ahead. So please do plan to join us again at some point. So we missed last week, so we had a big many birthdays to share with you. First is Russ Hobson on September 14th. Next is Kelsey Henderson on September 16th. I think she's probably the only one in the room. I would feel comfortable asking how old she is. So celebrated her birthday. Kaylin Wink, another member of the youth movement, is September 20th. Sandra Heath Taylor, also September 20th. John Sapola, September 21st. September 22nd. And Zachary Taylor, hey, September 22nd. So happy birthday to all of our Rotarians. We also have some club anniversaries we want to share. First of all, it's Kathy Tilley, 2 years, just 2 years. She
Seems like yesterday.
That's good, Holly Winter, who's been with us for both of them this year, and Bob Tim, 6 years. Glad to have so much longevity and consistency. We do have some announcements. Again, we have some big events in them, so we want to make sure we share those with you. I want to give a quick reminder that next Wednesday, we're having a board meeting, because Andre Chris out our district government will be here, so we moved it around the schedule. So next Wednesday, will be at 11 o'clock. Please not be here. Next Wednesday is actually that's it. So we're gonna have a group photo ops. Love to have everybody. Scott. You got it's a road. If you signed up, you already heard me, or you probably today, as to what I would like to do with the volunteer job. If you did sign up with me, but people, that offer out and offer whatever Scott and Don. You're welcome to show up. We're excited. Race starts at 8:30, so people sign in and get in there. We'll have them anywhere from 7 a.m. So come on out. So we can always use extra volunteers to cheer on London sidewalk. So have any questions about volunteer? Please get in touch with me. Okay. There's still time to sponsor, and there's still time to run. They'll be signing up runners, they all the way up on Friday evening. So if you want to run, you haven't signed up yet, reach out to one of us. We have about 100. Oh, we broke 100. And again, if you want to sponsor a small team, there's still time to do that. They can do it for the first year. Scott, everybody that they can have out there really makes sense. Next year. Yeah, so I'm really appreciating we can still do that Saturday. Then I will guarantee a church, but guarantee you that we'll go pretty much. Okay. And it is a fine event for the serious program. And I just want to thank all of you who have offered assistance one way or another, everything. Hey, cheers. You all can and also think the sponsors provided. Yeah. From scratch, and Ron's got just done fantastic. Here's a little help with the gala. So Carlton is helping coordinate the centerpieces. If you can make the 11 Monday afternoon, some help singing these, so please let them know. Appreciate Carlton's help with that. Kay, for those of you who didn't feel comfortable with technology, because he's taking checks. There are still people that use checks, so if you haven't bought a ticket, you still want to do that. But you know, today's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Cash too. Still. Okay. I would tell you, a lot of people work in these events, great for help. Judy Freeman, this one, but I mean, a lot of people. Let's just do it all by tickets. I'm going to pass 100 basketball. One to there, and they made it well. 110 plus, you can, so just really appreciate it. By the ticket and my sponsors. We got a couple minutes. Rich.
We've had a couple of happy hours. It's really, this stuff is not doing this, and I've never thought anything down since I had that threshold of some of the great things that everybody talks about, but I have two today. First of all, I wanted to introduce my colleague, my new colleague in Sweden, Peter, as they said, she comes to us by way of Atlanta, where she previously worked with the Belgian consulate doing PR on people there. I'm excited for the first time I get to do what I've seen great leaders do in the past, and that's it. I know some of the younger, smarter, and better than me, so taking place at a TV grade level, which I'm excited about. Thanks for. Secondly, I want to let you know about a great event. As you know, I've never talked to you about any concerts because we all have busy schedules on our dollars on living and finding to do entertaining things, but Black Violin is coming up in August, should be October 13th. And I want to tell you a little bit about it. It's the first time we've collaborated with Tree County Students. So we're working with the strings department there, and we're going to have our students and the students perform Black Violin that night before the show starts. The entire strings department from all the schools will be playing music up on the wall. And I want us to be there, and I encourage you to be there so you can demonstrate that our young people value it, right? So it may be your thing, it may not be your thing. I would just appeal to you to say, let's come and make the first collaboration with the school system successful. Not in dollars and cents, but in giving our time, our attention to things like this that are meaningful for us. Thank you very much.
Sure. Kurt mentioned the United Way motion last Wednesday. I've got $2 My granddaughter is a young singer, and that was her first live performance, and she was just taken aback with the opportunity to perform in front of films.
Well, we're going to put your kicked off its season last night. What a great concert. Several of y'all were there. The next concert, put it on your calendar, Tuesday, October 24th, the Passports. So going back to one, we're so fortunate to have such a talented, it's a great orchestra in town.
Thank you, President. We are honored today to have a special guest with us. Danny Cancel is the Director of Legislative Strategy and Senior Financial Analyst. He serves there at the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute. Danny leads GBEI, that's a mouthful, fiscal policy research and advocate for state budget and tax systems that is equitable, transparent, and promotes the well-being of all Georgians. Following his education at the University of Georgia, Bulldogs, where he earned both undergraduate and graduate degrees, and he served as the Director of Communications and Policy Advisor to the Office of Lieutenant Governor Casey Cable, where he has always been a friend of college career path. During his time under the Golden Dome, he worked to advocate on a wide range of legislative issues and initiatives. Danny is a PhD candidate at the University of Georgia and an active member of this committee. He's very active, very much active in this committee. You're probably hear some of that. A young man who has a lot of energy and made great impact already. So we're grateful that you consented to join us today, and glad to have you. Let's welcome.
Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you, Fred. And thank you all. It's so wonderful to be with you here today. And I'm so excited to see just the strength of this community and really a pleasure. And this afternoon, I'm going to present to you on the state, where we are as a state right now. The state budget is at the heart of everything that we do across our public schools, healthcare, economic development, so many of the things that are important to this community. And we really are in an unprecedented situation right now. Coming off of COVID, you may have heard about a record surplus that we have, a lot that's going on. So I'm excited to share some of those highlights with you today. And we're going to skip through some of this presentation and it gets a little bit wonky when we talk about state government. And I want to focus on the highlights today, the things that are most important. So you will see us go through a couple of these slides. Just a little bit briefly on who we are. As Gil said, from the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute, and we are a nonpartisan research and advocacy organization based in Atlanta that looks statewide, and where we focus on the issues that matter most to Georgians: education, healthcare, the economy, sort of those fundamentals, and where we help to translate what's going on in state government, what the state is considering. We analyze those proposals. We also look more broadly at issues, at the country, at other solutions, and try to promote those things that we think would make the greatest impact possible and have a whole team that is working across these issues. I personally specialize in fiscal policy, tax policy, and also lead our government affairs efforts. So we're unique also that we do both. We do research and we also advocate. And I will just say briefly, as we look at some of the legislators that represent this community, many of y'all, Senator Matt Bratz, chair of the Rules Committee, and others in the House, certainly depending on where you are. There are a lot of folks that can make a very big difference and have a loud voice at the state capitol, and certainly you engaging those legislators make a big difference. So I'll just say that briefly. So when we look at the state budget, a little over $32 billion, the vast majority of what the state does is education. Majority is education, and then the state has the largest role in healthcare out of that leads many of our communities, largely through Medicare, through providing insurance to about 3 million children and low-income folks as well. And then after that, you see sort of, a very conservative government. You see the next largest expense is going to be criminal legal systems, transportation. All other agencies are only going to make up about 5% of government across about 30 agencies. Then you can see the debt that we take out, finance capital projects, human services. And so that just gives you a glimpse that when we talk about state government, we're really talking about public education, healthcare, infrastructure, and the criminal legal system, and very limited functions outside of that. So going. And the other side of that is how do we pay for that? The vast majority comes from the income tax. This chart represents the revenue estimate, which is the way that we budget. The governor sets a number and estimates what we're going to collect. But actually, if we look at recent years, the income tax has actually been an even larger percentage of the budget. So the income tax powers of the state, about a quarter of revenues come from the sales tax. You'll see that sales tax primarily is on goods. We tax very few services in Georgia, and then you can see a mix of other smaller fees make up the rest of that $32 billion budget. So just one issue, to flag as we talk about that. When we, it's interesting to look at state and local taxes because even though the majority of money is earned from higher income folks, when we look at percentage of income, those who are at the lowest levels actually pay the largest share of their income in total tax. Most of that comes out of the sales tax. And so you can see the income tax is how we collect taxes from higher income folks mostly. The sales tax, as you're consuming more with your income, eats up a larger share of lower income folks. So it's part of a balanced system. Generally, that's why you want to have a variety of sources of revenue. You want to have income taxes, you want to have corporate income tax, sales tax, but it's important also to see how that affects different people in different ways, and that certainly brings us through the so just something to flag as we look ahead, and we can keep going. So as I mentioned, we are in unprecedented fiscal situation in Georgia right now, where we have the largest surplus by several magnitudes than at any time in our history before today. So right now you can see this chart. The way that Georgia government operates, has operated historically, is through budgeting and through having a state savings. So we call our savings account the revenue shortfall reserve. It's also referred to as the rainy day fund. And that is an account that is equivalent to, we have a cap in law that it's supposed to be equivalent to 15% or less of state revenues, of the state budget. And that's the level that through sort of 40 years of history has been determined as the level that we need to help protect against the recession. So if the recession hits, as folks lose their jobs, they have less money to spend in the economy, revenues fall. We have to keep spending up somehow. When we talk about schools, healthcare systems, things that can't easily be cut, the way that we would sustain that is by going into that savings account. And that's what we've done historically. So you can see this chart goes from the Great Recession to where we are today. We steadily built back that savings account. Now, if we look at the next chart, you can see now we're in a much different situation, where for the first time ever, we filled up the savings account. That happened at the end of 2021. And now we have twice as much as we have in the state savings account in what we call undesignated reserves above that. So the state savings account is about $5.3 billion. That's about 15% of state spending. On top of that, we have about $11 billion. And the interesting quirk here is that state law doesn't anticipate that. We have no process for what we would do if it's filled up our savings account. So it kind of defaults to laws that are decades old. And this is it's a good problem to have, because we have more resources than we're spending right now. And we have about 35% of the budget that is able to be freely allocated. Now, these are one-time funds, so it's not, the uses are a little bit different than what the state might be regulated. And we have a couple of proposals for that. We propose a child care trust fund. We propose school bus replacement, other things that you could do with one-time funds. But I do want to say that this is what sets up the budget situation going into the legislative session in January, and why the session is going to be so focused on the budget, so focused on a variety of proposals, from tax rebates to things like school buses, things like childcare, because for the first time, we have this really large pot of money that sits on top of the budget that we don't have laws right now to govern, and that is kind of what sets the table of the debate that we're going to. So, and now I want to highlight kind of a few other areas throughout the budget, and we'll move that, leave it open for questions, because I do want to kind of get it back to how the state budget, how all these issues affect the community, and be able to answer some of those questions. So one other parallel aspect that's going on as we move towards state session is in January, is that for the first time in about a decade, lawmakers are doing a comprehensive review of the tax code. So right now they are touring across the state. The House and Senate actually today had a meeting in Rome in North Georgia today, and they're doing a variety of these sessions. They'll have a couple probably closer to LaGrange in November. There's likely to be one in this part of the state, and they're evaluating all of the tax credits, all of the exemptions in the tax code, and that is, could have some really significant impacts. If you look across the film tax credit, it's the largest tax credit, but there are many others downstream that add up to tens of billions of dollars. And so that is something where it could potentially have a really big impact. We could create new credits. We could eliminate this of that process. The other aspect is that we have more items on hold right now than we've had in a very long time. We have about $240 million of spending that was frozen by the governor through a process called disregards, where the governor can basically strike any line of the budget or put a hold on that line until basically midway through the year when the General Assembly gets to come back and reconsider that item. So across healthcare, education, there's about $250 million right now that's on hold, and so we can get. Education, a couple of highlights here. One issue that we pointed out is a need for greater engagement in childcare. So you can see here, the state spends about $60 million per year on childcare, which is everything covering below 4 years old. We have a 4-year-old pre-K program that was founded through the lottery at Zell Miller as part of in conjunction with both, and we also have a child care program that's much more limited. So if we look at the next slide, you can see that basically for about a decade, we have this small program that creates about 50,000 slots for child care for extremely low income. So what we are going to be proposing as one of the ways to potentially allocate these surplus funds is creating a child care trust. So basically, the way that would work is that you could transfer several $1 billion into that trust fund that could then generate recurring revenue to be directed to child. So for example, if we took $7.5 billion of those surplus funds and said we're going to make a long-term commitment to child care in Georgia and estimated a fairly conservative rate of return in line with what we do with other pension systems that we have, like TRS, for teachers, employee retirement system. Those operate about a 7 to 8% return a year. So if you said we're just going to give out 5% and we'll leave 2% to continue to grow the fund, that would be about $400 million a year that we could invest in childcare. And those are the type of proposals that are made possible because of the surplus. But this is kind of a glaring area of need that we see. You can obviously work with Georgia facing this. It is one of the things that holds our weight. And it's an area of increased debate on both sides of the aisle. How can we address it? And something that we're very focused on. So to keep going, you can see, that there are other gaps as well. Pre-K, certainly you can see about $5,000 per student. Kindergarten about $7,000 per student. And so really over the past 30 years, we've tried to establish this universal pre-K program, and that's largely been a really great success. Today we have about $450 million going to pre-K, and we're continuing to grow that through the lottery. So you can see here a couple of other big changes in the larger education budget. One of the things that is straining our local schools right now is a really big increase in the cost of healthcare for employees. So over the next 2 years, the cost of getting health insurance to every single employee is increasing by $76 million. So that's $7,600 more expensive to hire a teacher, to hire a bus driver, a custodian, and that is a cost that's being passed on by the state to local school districts. So that's something that we try to stay very aware of, because you only have so much of a tax base, that you can generate revenue to do that. And quite frankly, the state has more tools to be able to generate those revenues. And obviously, as we talked about, a really big surplus right now. So that's an ongoing issue where, to just be very direct, local school districts are more stretched than they've ever been, and have a greater burden right now that's been added to really significantly this year. So to keep going. And just, quickly, the state deals with inflation as well. Part of the reason why you've seen revenue numbers jump so significantly is because it's a consequence of inflation. Goods have got more expensive. They're being taxed with sales tax. Wages have gone up in response to inflation, as part of inflation. And that affects everything. That affects teacher salaries too. A teacher today is making about $7,000 less in equivalent dollars than they were in 2010. So this is just to keep in mind that inflation affects the salaries the state pays as well, and sometimes the state will be a lot slower to respond to that than the private sector, but that does add up. So you can also see here another big strain on local school districts, and this is why we think that school buses are so important, is basically in the early 2000s, the state froze its funding for local transportation. That didn't stop transportation costs from going up. You can see here now we're spending about $1.1 billion on transportation to get over 900,000 kids across the state to school every day. That's kind of the most basic thing you have to do. You have to get kids to school on time, or nothing else works. So districts, have to find ways to do that. Even though the state isn't chipping in money, they've got to pay money around, and they've had to do that more and more in recent years. Right now, about 1/3 of all the school buses on the road in Georgia are more than 15 years old. And that can be a real problem. It costs a lot of money to maintain those old buses. So this is one of the big issues that is right now unsolved, but that we think the surplus could be a really good one-time use for replace those buses. It's kind of it fits really well with that purpose, and will save money over time. So that's sort of what we look for when we talk about one-time uses of money. Just one more, kind of core part of what's missing in Georgia when we talk about public school funding. And I'll just say briefly, in Georgia, we funded our schools according to the same formula since 1986. So this is another big issue that every year, in recent years, the General Assembly has wrestled with. How do we update our funding for schools to reflect the modern challenges of students in the world we live in now that's much different from the world we lived in 1986. And one of the things, kind of the main area that we've fallen behind is, if you look at this map, this is funding specifically for poverty. And one of the things that just research has revealed is, if you look at poverty, it correlates really well with student outcomes. Because when you don't fix those gaps, when the kid's hungry at school, it's really hard to learn. When you don't have clean clothes, it's just, having those barriers to entry hold a lot of kids back, and that ripples through later in the system. So one of the gaps that we can close is adding poverty as a funding formula consideration. But reforming that funding formula is something that I think we're going to hear a lot more about in recent years, and it's sort of been a feature of major campaigns in recent history. We can skip ahead. I'll just flag the last slide. We talked about the lottery. All lottery dollars in Georgia are dedicated to two purposes: pre-kindergarten funding and home scholarships for higher education. So you can see this chart, which is the lottery reserves, which indicates the amount that's left over at the end of every year from the lottery. So you can see we're spending less in the lottery than we're collecting. Lottery has been very successful in recent years. And that's why this year you saw, for the first time in a decade, you're fully funded Hope, according to tuition. So it used to be about 90% of tuition. This year it's going to be 100% for the first time since 2012. That is a big victory. It's one that we can sustain. And you'll see also here, there's more that we can do on pre-K. And then there is another issue that could add to this revenue, which is sports betting. So there are two ways to legalize sports betting in Georgia. There is adding it to the lottery, which would govern it through these rules, or amending the Constitution to create a new process. In Georgia, our Constitution says all gambling besides the lottery is alcohol. And so if we add it to the lottery, that's about $100 million every year if our lottery reforms in line with states like Tennessee with sports betting that would be added to this revenue. So that's money that would go to higher education and pre-K and mean that we could expand those programs further. And just just briefly, when I talked about the disregards, most of those affect health spending. So there are some of those that are behavioral health. We were supposed to phase in an increase for salaries for some of those behavioral health workers. Right now, they're making $10 an hour. Obviously, many of y'all are employing people. The challenges of hiring. To hire somebody with a specialized credential for $10 an hour is almost impossible. So we're contracting a lot of those out to private providers right now. They're giving the state their workers at a rate. We need to fix that. A big part of what we try to do is just say, if you didn't have higher turnover, we could actually save money. If you pay people a little bit more and you didn't turn them over as often, that's a good way to run the state a little more like a business. Make those calculations on the front end and try to manage your staff a little bit better. And that's an area that we're falling short of right now. So you can see just this graphic speaks to that. So statewide, across our state's entire workforce, the full-time annual turnover rate last year was 29%. 29% of our state employees turned over in a year. That indicates that we're not paying people enough. They're being, they're finding jobs that are better, that are paying higher salaries in the private sector. And also that as we are losing people, we're asking them to do more and kind of making some of these jobs, like for example, corrections officers, the annual person over turnover rate is over 90%. Because no one, very few people, I'll say, want to do that job for $30,000 a year. And once they get in, they find that it's extremely difficult to do it. So that's just to say that we have some issues in our state workforce that need to be addressed. And we've been slow to respond, particularly as inflation has kind of changed the wage landscape really quickly over just a couple of years. This is something that's hit the state really hard. So this is an issue that is going to be at the core of the debate. One other thing that I'll just say really quickly is right now, so during the pandemic, Medicaid rules were basically suspended. And what the federal government did after that was to say that because we did a lot of unusual things in how we launched Medicaid, all Medicaid enrollees now have to be redetermined to see if they're still eligible. And so most of the people who have Medicaid in Georgia are children. So we are going through a process right now where every enrollee has to be contacted and has to have their information re-verified, or they have to have basically some kind of check that re-entry something in the system. So we're seeing hundreds of thousands of children right now lose their coverage in a short-term way where they are very likely still eligible. But what will re-trigger their coverage is when they go to the emergency or when they have a health event, and then their parents are stuck with a hospital bill that they will pay, and it was something that could have been avoided in the first place. So this is just an ongoing challenge. It's something the federal government has ordered the state to do. The state's never taken on something like processing eligibility for 3 million people in the course of about a year. So this is just an ongoing problem to be aware of that's going to affect the healthcare system. It's going to affect our public schools. It's just another thing that is happening uniquely this year that does have ripples. And where there are different campaigns to try to spread awareness, make sure people who have Medicaid know that if you haven't rechecked your eligibility, it's going to be redetermined at some point in the next year. And so that's something that we're dealing with. We can see here about 100,000 kids primarily have lost full coverage so far. We expect them to be re-enrolled, but it's a problem that needs to be fixed. And so we can keep going. You can see here just another program along those lines. The governor has launched a limited Medicaid expansion program that started on July 1st. And basically this is an ongoing issue because under full Medicaid expansion, the state would get a 90% match rate from the federal government to cover about 500,000. We've chosen a different path that will give us a match rate of about a third of that to cover many fewer people. And so if we continue, you'll see that just right now, the state is on a path to figure out how much that proposal is going to cost based on how many people enroll. So our estimates are it could cost somewhere between $100 and $900 million. And so that remains to be seen. And that could trigger a shift to a broader Medicaid expansion that has its cost fixed. So you can see there the cost per enrollee is about 1/5. The next slide. You can see that this is just kind of something that we point out, that just is an ongoing issue because of how the federal government funds Medicaid in the way of the Affordable Care Act. And they revised this rule again in the last couple of years, but it's kept it going this way. So now, Georgia is one of 10 states that still hasn't accepted that federal funding, and it creates an issue, that hasn't been resolved, even though we've launched this program. And so, this just kind of summarizes that we're going through this unprecedented launch of, having to re-verify the eligibility of 3 million people, and at the same time, we're launching a limited Medicaid expansion. So a lot is going on in the healthcare system right now. And we can move through these slides as well. And this just shows you the Department of Human Services is the agency that's managing that redetermination. We're working with the Medicaid agency, and they have some issues as well in terms of the data that we can address. So we can skip ahead to questions. And so just in summary, what we've seen is the state had a really tough climb from the Great Recession. During the Great Recession, we were hit very hard. We implemented really deep budget cuts, and it was hard to restore those. Those restorations were hard fought over about a decade. It took us between 2010 and 2019 to even be able to fund our 1986 funding formula for QBE4. And then we saw is during the pandemic, revenues increased massively. Part of that was a consequence of the huge federal intervention. Part of that was a consequence of inflation that pushed up incomes and sales taxes. Part of it was a factor that we've grown by 500,000 people over the last 5 years. And so that has also pushed up revenue. But the bottom line is that we have gaps, we have ways to spend that money, but fortunately, we have more resources on hand than we've ever had before. We have about 5 times more cash on hand than ever before, and we have coming in on a recurring basis as well. So there's a lot to be encouraged by, but there's certainly a lot to do. And I know that's it's a big presentation, so I'd be happy to answer the questions.
Danny, I applaud you. Very informative. I thought very objective. First, a question to make sure I'm not trapping myself. Did Alan Hess found GBPI?
Alan did, yeah. That was well before my time, but yes.
And just a quick story. When I decided not to run again in 2012, Alan asked me on your board. So I think the Institute does a lot of good work. But a question, I'm hesitant to ask this question. On a spectrum of conservative to liberal, it used to be that yours was towards the liberal, and the foundation across town, policy foundation, was more conservative. Is that still true today?
Well, I mean, I think, we are, we're obviously not. And I myself, as you heard in the introduction, worked at Casey Cagle for about 5 years. And, so, certainly, I mean, the way I view it is basically everything that we propose is bipartisan. Has support from across the aisle. And we try to, try to behave that way. I mean, you will see us sometimes, I think that the media does like to, it's a cleaner narrative if you have somebody on the left and somebody on the right. So you will see that frame in. There are issues that we talk about that are maybe more conventionally discussed, in kind of a center left arena, things like, racial equity, things like just asking the hard questions. So, how do we move the state forward? But I really do think that we try to bring a objective framing and in the things that we propose, we're always trying to find a path for Republicans to get us together. Thank you. Well, thank you.
Your slide about the disproportionate effect on middle income and lower income families with regard to income tax as a percentage of income. And your slide about how income tax and sales tax are the large crowd of surplus. Advocating for taking a look at the income tax rate ordinance so that the part of the legislative control could create more after tax income.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And so actually in January, we're going to be having two really big changes with that that are kind of the biggest shifts that we've seen really since the income tax was created in the 30s. The first is going to a flat tax. Right now we have a tax that is 1 to 5.75%. In January it will become just 5.49%. So that is about, but it'll be a little bit less than sort of the average of all of those rates would be. The bigger change that will impact more people is that the standard deduction is going up significantly. So the standard deduction now is, we have a personal exemption in the standard deduction that work together. And it will give you generally, depending on the size of the family, we are coming close to doubling the standard deduction. We're going to go to a number that's in line with federal government, about 12,000 for individuals, 24,000 for married couples. And in Georgia, that's close to 90%. So those are big improvements. What we would like to really see as a child tax credit is to, as an additional measure, that's a program to see the federal level, to see the states do it. But I think it does raise questions. And when we're doing this largely review of tax credits, there are a couple of philosophies. What we would generally say is the more that you get to broad-based credits that go to individuals, the better. You could have a system that has a lot of credits for certain industries, and we're more on the spectrum of doing that right now versus tax credits that go to families that are unique to the state. So that is something we don't do a lot. We're more on the business tax credit side right now, and we'd like to see agents able to show their idea. I mean, I think a very big issue that we have sort of focused is how do we address childcare? How do we try to move that forward from the side of providers and also from parents? But there are resources that are going to push a variety of tax issues, I think, to be considered in January. So then the other thing that I'll say is we've seen the sales change in the last couple of years a lot too. So we put a online sales tax right before the pandemic, and just this year we're now going to start taxing digital downloads in some cases. And so you're going to see sales tax revenue because of that continuing to increase. And that also could push us to say, are there some things that shouldn't be taxed in sales tax, or should we just continue to grow the things? So,
Real good, thank you for all the presentation. So I would like to ask you, do you see or do you think that salaries keeping up with inflation? And if they're not, what can be done to promote that, get salaries in line?
Right, from the perspective of the state government, no, they're not, they're plainly not. You know, if you look at state, okay, you say state spending overall from 2019 to 2024, it's grown by an average of about 3.5% per year. And you might say, well, that sounds okay. Inflation in Georgia over those 5 years has grown by an average of about 4% per year. So by definition, inflation has been increasing faster than spending. At the same time, you know, we had kept the workforce about steady, and we've made some increases. We've made a 2% or about $2,000 across the board pay increase this year. But we just, you know, because we're trying to make up for essentially a decade of not having the resources to be able to, you know, meet the need essentially, we're set back. And at the same time, the need for schools has changed too. And so that's an area where, you know, just unfortunately, even though we had done some good things on teacher pay, a lot of we haven't done enough to keep up with inflation. And particularly if you look at the larger number of teachers that are paid with local dollars. You know, that is kind of one of the is that the state doesn't pay all teachers. So if we say we want all teachers to get a $5,000 pay increase, actually we're committing your local school to find about half of the money necessary to do it. And so it has to work in conjunction. And we haven't found that formula yet, but we're you know, and I'll just say, if you look at the average of the state workforce, the starting salary right now is about $36,000 a year. The workforce median is about $46,000 per year. And so because of just how much turnover we've seen, you know, we have a more junior workforce than we've had in a while. We have a workforce that's turning over faster, and that's a further challenge here. So, but it's not a silver bullet. You know, it's not saying, okay, $10,000 to everybody. I think we have to do kind of the hard work of saying, you know, behavioral caseworkers, teachers, you know, kind of taking it one issue at a time.
So, great presentation, like I said, always educational. Always. Thank you, Catherine, for to us today, and your honor, donation of holding plus, which is program issues to. They will tell you quickly the next program, so then the district governor will be with us next week. October 4th, we'll have Cody X and Ryan Lee James, Dr. Ryan Lee James, some of the state's top experts on literacy, and from the Land Speech School, Cox campus in the Raleigh Center. October 11th, we'll have Bill Reeves, who is an independent film producer and bring for William to us. And then on October 18th, we'll have Mick Bender Hughes. That's an acronym. Saturday, we're adjourned.
I'm taking my computer right now, and I'm like,